Am I good? Welcome, everybody. Good morning. Good morning. I should say good Monday morning. You all get 1,000 extra points for being here this early. My name is Amanda Lewis, and I am thrilled to welcome you here today. I serve as the director of the Institute for Research on Race and Public Policy, also known as IRRPP. For those who are not familiar, IRRPP is dedicated to advancing research, education, and dialogue on racial and ethnic inequities through our partnerships such as the one with the African Descent Citizens Reparations Commission, also known as ADCRC. We aim to deepen our understanding of systemic inequities and highlight pathways towards justice. Our work is rooted in fostering collaboration among scholars, students, and community members to address pressing issues of race and public policy. I have a few housekeeping things before I introduce our illustrious speakers. First, we have a videographer present today, and we will be taking photos throughout the event. The video will be available on our website and YouTube channel in a few weeks. After the program, there will be a Q&A session. You hopefully got handed note cards as you're coming in. Please write your questions down, and then I will pose them to the panelists. And for those of you on Zoom, we're using Zoom's version of live transcription to caption this event, and it is still not the best, so we apologize ahead of time for any mistakes. To begin with today, we're very honored to have Raven DeVaughn here to welcome us. Ms. DeVaughn was appointed director of the Illinois Department of Central Management Services, or CMS, in January of 2023 by Governor Pritzker. This is a massive job, and we are so grateful to have her doing it. Ms. DeVaughn oversees the agency's $8 billion annual budget and a staff of nearly 800 responsible for managing the state's administrative functions. I won't list them all here, but she is also administratively in charge of the African Descent Citizens Reparations Commission and other critical roles, and has used her wealth of experience with economic inclusion in both the public and private sector to lower barriers to access to critical opportunities across Illinois. So please join me in welcoming her up here.
I wish I could take someone everywhere with me to introduce me, because I'm like, who did all that? I don't think it was me. Thank you so much, Amanda, for the kind words. I'm going to take a small point of personal privilege. I have some beautiful words that we have written, but I am a descendant of slaves. I'm also the fruit of the Great Migration. I'm a first-generation Chicagoan. I know y'all like, oh, she's only 25. How did that happen? But I am, my father was born in Natchez, Mississippi. My mother was born in Roberta, Georgia. And the land where my mother's family were slaves, we still own in my family today. The shack where my grandmother was born and her grandmother was born into slavery still stands, and I've been in it several times. I used to spend my summers in Roberta, Georgia. So the opportunity to be able to support this work is absolutely divine, but it's also a part of my heritage and my lineage, and I'm so grateful for that. When I was recruited to come to work at the state, they said lots of things that maybe weren't so true, but the one thing that they said, hey, this Reparations Commission is coming aboard and it'll be at CMS. And that piqued my interest. And so to be able to support this amazing work, because if you know what CMS does, we're really the operational engine of the state. You say, why there? But I will tell you, I personally think there is no better place for this work because we have an insight into everything that is state government, and we have amazing staff who is committed to this work, and we're able to support it in a way that I don't think any other state agency could, and certainly this is a passion for me as the leader of CMS. So again, thank you. My name is Raven DeVaughn. It's my honor to serve as director of the Illinois Department of Central Management Services, and as the administrative support of the African Descent Citizens Reparations Commission, or ADCRC. It is truly an honor to welcome you all here today. On behalf of ADCRC, it has been a true privilege to collaborate with the UIC Institute for Research on Race and Public Policy. This partnership is helping to bring the public a deeper, more comprehensive understanding of the harms inflicted on Black Illinoisans through the creation of the Harms Report, taking account a history of racial harm and injustice against Black Illinoisans. Another point of personal privilege, Chair Slaughter joins us here from the commission. He's in higher ed. It was very important, certainly to me and to him, that we found a home that would do this work justice. I always thought it needed to be higher ed. I was open, because you gotta be open when you're courting, but I knew that UIC was the right place. For one, we are a part of the state, but because of this public policy working, this group, I knew that this was it. So I was really happy when we were able to make it work. Also, procurement rules made it a lot easier. So, oh, don't say that. Four-letter word, I know. Okay, we gather not only to amplify awareness of this report, but to acknowledge a truth, one that has too often been overlooked, understated, and misunderstood. For many, Illinois, it has long been viewed as simply as a free state, a place assumed to be on the right side of history. But this report challenges that narrative and invites us to confront a more complex and sobering reality, that even as a free state, Illinois benefited from and participated in systems that upheld slavery, racial exclusion, and economic exploitation. The Harms Report represents a significant step toward understanding the impact of racial injustice in our state. This report is the result of rigorous scholarship, deep research, and the lived experiences and voices of Black communities across Illinois. It tells a story that stretches from before Illinois was formally established as a state to the present day. It shares stories of resilience, but also of systemic harm, exclusion, and inequity that has shaped generations. Today, this report is helping us engage in meaningful, informed conversations about repair, redress, and restoration. We are especially grateful to the scholars, researchers, community leaders, and partners who contributed to this report and who continue to advance this work with integrity and purpose. And to our panelists, thank you for lending your expertise and your voices to help guide us through the report's findings and their implications, particularly as we consider the future of reparation efforts here in Illinois. To everyone in attendance, your presence matters, your engagement matters. This work calls for all of us across sectors, communities, and perspectives to listen, learn, and to act. As we begin today's program, I invite you to lean in with open minds and open hearts. Let us honor the truth, stand fully in our shared history, and commit ourselves to building a more just and equitable future for all. Thank you. I am excited to hear what comes from this. I also invite you all, I think Saturday, we got a public hearing, Chair Slaughter, okay. I think we're at Malcolm X? DuSable. We're at DuSable. So more to come, adcrc.illinois.gov. I'd also like to honor, we have Mikasa Johnson, who is the project manager for this work. Her job is to make sure we get what we study, and then we advance the work to get what it is that we deserve to repair this harm. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I wanted to say a couple things, and then I'm going to introduce our illustrious team of speakers today. I just want to say that IRRPP, the full team of us, can you raise your hands, folks, IRPP folks who are around the room in various places? We're really honored to do this work. It is some of the work that we're proudest of, our collaborations with the state, especially in this moment when historical amnesia seems to be the thing that is being pushed all over the place. Our ability to work with folks like CMS and the ADCRC, like IDHS, our partner, Terrion, I can't even speak this morning. Karenina Grimble is here, but folks in the state who are really leaning in, not just in acknowledging this history, but working actively to address the long-term harms that have been done across the state and thinking about how to advance equity and justice for everybody in the state. I'm not always, the most, a lot of things, but it makes me very proud to be in Illinois. And when we travel around the country and talk about the work we're doing, I often say that it is possible because of the state government right now and the way it's leaning in at a moment when lots of folks are leaning out. So I want to just say that. I also want to thank briefly, I know Terrion's probably going to say this, the amazing team of folks who really did this work, did it excellently, and did it quickly. Almethea's hiding in the back there, but she's one of the key people on this, Almethea Franklin, and some other folks who you'll hear about in a minute. So I'm going to introduce the speakers today. I'm going to do so briefly. They all have very long bios. I could spend the whole time talking about that, but instead I will be brief so you can hear from them. We're going to start by hearing from the lead on this project, Dr. Terrion Williamson, who's a professor here of Black Studies and Gender and Women's Studies, and she also serves as the founding director of the Black Midwest Initiative. She's the author of Scandalize My Name, Black Feminist Practice and the Making of Black Social Life. She was born and raised in Peoria, and even though she has had a lot of things already on her plate when we approached her about this project, it was so much at the center of her long career of intellectual work that she paused only for a moment before she said yes, I'll say. Then after Dr. Williamson's had a chance to talk about the overall findings, we'll have this wonderful panel. Marvin Slaughter Jr., who is the board chair of the African Citizens Descent Reparations Commission. He's also an applied policy researcher and works at the University of Chicago's Inclusive Economy Lab. He's done some writing and research himself with Sandy Darity and Kristen Mullen on Bill for Black Reparations, and he has extensive policy and political experience working for social equity. We have Alonzo Ward, who is an associate professor of history at Eastern Illinois University and has authored several articles on Black workers in Illinois. He has a wonderful essay in the report that I encourage you to read if you have not already. His current book project, Relegated to the Bottom, Illinois African American Workers and Their Struggle Against Systematic Oppression During the Early Jim Crow Era, explores Black labor in Illinois during the 19th century. Then we have Amber Hendley, who, as far as I can tell, is involved in so many different projects around the city and state, not only advancing understanding about the history of harm against African Americans in the state, but involved in many different projects focused on repair, including Unblock Englewood, a project that combines art and rehabilitation to redress decades of discrimination by helping Englewood homeowners build equity. She's also the lead archival researcher for the City of Chicago's Black Reparations study, and I could go on and on. She's also a co-author of another report that you should all look at if you haven't, The Plunder of Black Wealth in Chicago, which is about the history of housing contracts in the city. And finally, we have our dear colleague, Dr. Elizabeth Todd-Breland, a brilliant historian, a faculty affiliate in Black Studies. She's the author of A Political Education, Black Politics and Education Reform in Chicago, and co-author of I Didn't Come Here to Lie, My Life in Education with Karen Lewis. Her research and teaching focus on U.S. urban history, and she also has a really beautiful, her and Amber both have beautiful essays in the report. So we're going to start with Dr. Williamson, and then I will facilitate a conversation, so get your note cards going, and we'll have time for questions. Thanks.
Sorry.
All right. Good morning, everyone.
Good
morning. Today is the first day that I have seen that big book that you picked up. It's the first time I've seen it in person. had that moment, I almost started to tear up and cry because it is actually a real thing in the world. So I'm really grateful to have been given the opportunity to do this work. I count it as a privilege. And Amanda is correct. I definitely paused when I was asked about doing this for a whole host of reasons, but feel really grateful to have had the opportunity. And I'm going to jump into it quickly because I know what you really want to get to is the discussion with the panelists. But what I am here to do is to just give a bit of an overview of the process of getting to the document that some of you hold in your hands and hopefully people online are able to access via the link, to talk about how we get to this moment. And I'm going to say their names at the end in acknowledgments, but also I think I'm seeing at least two of the authors of the report. Can you just raise your hands? Kamara and Almethea. So grateful. It took a team, a village, an organization, a whole bunch of people to make this project happen, but in particular, I want to make sure to shout them out. Okay, so how do we get here? So this project started about 2 years ago when we established the four people research team that did the bulk of the writing that makes up the essays that are within the document. Two of those were grad students who are still continuing to work on dissertations, one who is a postdoc scholar, and then myself. And so over the summer, we pulled that team together. The work really began in August of 2024. And the first draft, a very, very early rough draft, was workshopped the next April with a team of 5 expert consultants who helped us to pull it into better shape and gave us feedback on what we had done to that point. The next August, we submitted the full draft that we had at that time to the research subcommittee, who we had been meeting with occasionally over the year, and they also gave us really critical and important feedback for the document at that time. We completed the document last December, and it was released in February. So that gives you a sense of how quickly this all came together. And what you see in the document, much of it is a review of the extant literature on the communities Black people and Black communities in Illinois. We looked at research studies, we looked at digital projects. We did some small bit in the amount of time we had, we were limited in how much archival work we could do, but there was some bit of archival work there as well. And so the key components of the report, there's an executive summary right at the beginning. I'm going to spend the most time today talking about those 9 core sections that look at 9 broad categories of harm that we covered. That's what I'll spend the bulk of the time talking about. We also have 14 expert commentaries. There's a timeline of key events. There's a short reparations reading list of contemporary texts for people who are interested in learning more about the reparations movement. There is a rather extensive bibliography. Of course, even though this is a slightly lengthy report at 300 pages, it certainly couldn't get to all of the harms that have been experienced by Black people across the state. So the bibliography is meant to help fortify the work and give people another starting place from which to engage these issues. And then because this is a research document, there's a pretty extensive list of endnotes at the end. 2 things I want to say before moving on here is that one of the reasons I'm so grateful to have been able to do this project has to do with my own personal history and personal story and how I get here. I was a student at UIC, and I live in Chicago now, but it does turn out that Chicago is a city and not a state. It turns out that everything that is downstate, I come from one of those downstate places, which is Peoria, Illinois. It takes you about 10 minutes of knowing me, maybe less, to find that out. I'm a big booster. I'm a big Peoria booster. And one of the things that my team will tell you is that I kept saying is like, but it's not just Chicago. But to ensure that we were attending to the entirety of the state. This is a little difficult because for people who do work on the state know there's a pretty extended literature around Black Chicago, but less so in other parts of the state. So we did what we could with what was there, but part of what I will say about what is to be done next is that we need more robust literature and histories of other places. And a lot of people who are doing that work are not people like me who work in colleges and institutions, but are doing like grassroots level work, who have those critically important histories. So Chicago, there's a lot of Chicago in the report. I think that's important. Chicago is seen as a kind of Black Mecca. The history is critically important. We attend to Chicago heavily, but we are also really concerned with thinking about the entirety of the state. The other thing that I just want to make sure that people recognize is that there are no recommendations here, and because that was not our charge. This is actually a harms report. It's not the recommendations, and perhaps Chair Slaughter will talk more about that when he's up on the panel, are to come. And what we are doing is meant to inform the recommendations that are to come. There are 14 expert commentaries. This, what you see on the screen now, is the list of people who contributed expert commentaries to the document. This helped, again, because we were moving so swiftly and had so much ground to cover. These commentaries helped to fortify the work that we were doing. People who were writing out of their own experience and expertise, many who have written books about the histories of Black people in Chicago contributed really critically important commentaries, and some of those folks will be on the panel today. So in the introduction, we begin by talking a little bit about reparations efforts across the U.S. Here, I'm starting at a more contemporary moment, but to be clear, the reparations movement begins as at least as far back as the Civil War. People were struggling for some form of reparations. The movement goes back that far. But looking at the sort of legislative work around reparations, one of the most high-profile moments is in 1989 when H.R. 40, which is, it's called H.R. 40, it's the Commission to Study and Develop Reparations Proposals for African Americans. Representative Conyers of Michigan introduces this to Congress. He continues to introduce it every year until he retires 30 years later. It wasn't until 2021 when it finally advanced out of committee for the first time. So there has been someone on the federal level who has been advocating, and there have been community groups advocating around this legislation for a very long time. In 2020, around the protests and the uprisings that happened in 2020, one of the things that happens is the Why We Can't Wait campaign, which is a coalition of reparation groups that advocate for the passage of H.R. 40 in the wake of all of the unrest of 2020. After that moment, we see the California Task Force established, and this is important because it's the first statewide initiative, statewide and state-enacted reparations task force in 2020 by California. And then again, we see the H.R. 40 advances in 2021, and then it's the next year when Illinois, which is the second state to have such a task force. And then the California report is released. Amanda likes to talk about how very long it is. It's about 1,000 pages long. Ours is not. You're welcome. But that helps to set a kind of precedent and has been one of the sort of, it's a very different kind of report. And one is that it is both a harms report and recommendations. Again, our report does not have the recommendations, just to be clear. And California last year established the Bureau for Descendants of American Slavery, the first such initiative to happen. That was established under the Gavin Newsom administration. At the same time, Newsom did veto legislation that would have provided descendants benefits for descendants. So the struggle continues there. And then our report was released this year. Reparations efforts have been ongoing in Illinois as well. Many of you will know, maybe some of you will not, about the reparations ordinance that Chicago passed in 2015 around the Burge torture victims. That was the first municipal reparations ordinance in the country to address police violence. And then 2 years later, the Chicago Torture Justice Center opened on Woodlawn on the south side. 2021, Evanston launched the Restorative Housing Program. That is the first municipal ordinance to deal directly with housing discrimination in the country. So this is to say, I wanted to point this out here because it's to say that Illinois is really on the vanguard of this movement in these ways. And then there are a number of organizations throughout the state, and including Chicago. Please don't get mad if you don't see your name up here. There are others. These are just a couple that I wanted to point out. The Southside Community Reparations Coalition, through the Chicago Urban League, that has been talking to community members and pulling together recommendations, and the same with Reinvest to Repair, a project of the Black Roots Alliance. And these initiatives, and they're not always called reparations. We can talk about why that is. Not everything is called reparations. Sometimes they're talked about as racial justice initiatives, but these are happening throughout the state, including in places like Champaign-Urbana, Peoria, East St. Louis, Springfield, and Oak Park. And so I want to get into quickly talking about getting into the various sections. Again, I can't go into any real length here on any of these, but I hope that if there are things that people's interest, they'll go back to those sections of the report and learn more about them. So as I was already mentioned, Illinois ostensibly entered the Union as a free state in 1818, but it turned out that slavery was actually allowed under certain circumstances within the borders of Illinois. And that the labor of enslaved people was actually critically important to early Illinois economy. One example that we give is the salt marshes in Gallatin and Saline counties in the southern part of the state. The salt marshes were the state's first major industry. They relied heavily on enslaved labor, and they generated a sizable revenue for the state. And so, quoting here one of the expert commentaries, Scott Harriman, through legal proceedings and political machinations, slaveholders and their many allies created exemptions to abolition laws that kept people trapped in bondage until the eve of the Civil War. So at least we get too excited, pat ourselves too much on the back about being a free state. Part of what we do here is to talk about the ways in which that is very much qualified in the state. Also an outcome of bondage, right, is we talk a lot about racial terror. Illinois had the third highest number of lynchings outside of the South between the Civil War and World War III. Sundiata Chajua, who is at UIUC, there's a chart in the document where he works to outline what he calls racial terror lynchings that happened throughout various places throughout the state. Major race riots took place throughout the state, in places like Chicago, of course, but also Springfield and St. Louis. The riot in Springfield in 1908 was actually the catalyst for the creation of the NAACP the next year in 1909. Also, Illinois had the dubious distinction of leading the nation in the number of sundown towns. The historian David Roediger contributes a commentary to the report in which he talks about being from a sundown town. He's a white historian, and he talks about being from a sundown town, Columbia, in the southern part of the state, and what that meant, and how even as a working poor, working class white person, the kinds of privileges that were given to him. Sundown town, he says, identifies simply and remorselessly towns in which African Americans could not stay after dark and therefore could not live. And depending upon what parts of the state we live on, I certainly am one. You might know what it is like to live near such a place. This map that is here, you can't, it's not extremely distinct, but the reason I wanted to show this here is because I think it makes one thing really evident. Even if you can't see which each dot represents, all you have to do is know the map a little bit to know what's happening here, to see that Illinois, that where the big cluster of dots happens is happening in Illinois. And I think that's important and that matters, and that's a history we definitely have yet to reckon with. Moving on to political disenfranchisement. The Illinois Black Codes, they're also referred to in the literature as the Black Laws, were in effect until 1865. These are just a few of the things the Black Codes did. denied Black people the right to vote, restricted the mobility of Black people, and restricted their ability to gather in groups of more than 2 or 3 people, prevented Black residents from testifying in court against white residents, and on and on. We know, thinking about this in terms of the franchise and voting, we all know that the 15th Amendment gave Black men the right to vote. The 19th Amendment, 1920, gives Black women the right to vote. But what I want to tag here is that 50-year difference between the two, because I think that what is also really critical about the work we do around reparations is to recognize, as Robin Kelly and other scholars have told us, that that disenfranchisement, that discrimination, that gender matters when we're talking about these things, and it affects groups differently. So I just wanted to note that here. And also, maybe many of us have seen that picture of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. In Chicago during the Chicago Freedom Movement, working with organizers on the ground, and he gets hit gets hit in the head with a rock. Maybe many people have seen that image. And when King says that despite all the work he's done throughout the South, across the country, that he'd never seen anything so hostile or so hateful as what he'd witnessed happening in Chicago. Following that, a few years later, we have the assassinations of Fred Hampton and Mark Clark of the Black Panther Party. And so the idea here, I'm just moving quickly through this because we're thinking about the various ways that political disenfranchisement functions across space and time for Black people, and up until the current moment. So it was just in 2021 that the state ended prison gerrymandering, which artificially inflates rural white communities where prisons are located and siphons votes representation away from Black communities. So the idea here, what we're trying to do in the report, is show this, the thread of this long history from something as far back as the Black codes to where we are just now in ending prison gerrymandering. The next section is stolen economic labor. We discuss racial and mob attacks against Black residents that took place in small communities like Braidwood and Verdun and Panna, which targeted Black workers. We discussed how New Deal programs requiring workers to hold union membership actually often discriminated against Black workers and incentivized the displacement of Black workers. Dr. Ward, who is here today, helps us to think through this in the report, and we'll perhaps talk a little bit more about this today in his comments, but suggests that Black workers participated in strike breaking and anti-union activities as a form of self-preservation. So there's a give and take between what it means to be part of union membership during this time. And one of the other expert commentaries by Kelly Lemon talks about Black farmers, which I think there's also much more work to be done here, right? And how farmers were deliberately steered to ecologically vulnerable and undervalued land, and that continues to resonate today. Here I'm just giving you an example of the many different infographics that are put together by the team to help to visualize the rates of disparities that are happening that we see. So one example here, at the bottom, the Black median net worth in Illinois is 15% of the white median net worth. And so it's just another way of visualizing what those disparities look like, and you'll see those throughout the document. Policing and the legal system, we discuss a long history of monitoring of Black activity by law enforcement. We note that between 1978 and 1998, the Illinois prison population grew by more than 260%, and that by 2000, Black residents were 60% of the incarcerated population in Illinois, although just 15% of the overall population. Andy Clarno, who is a professor here, also highlights in the 2014 report that young people in Chicago took to the United Nations called We Charge Genocide, which was about violence on behalf of the Chicago Police Department. I've already talked about the Reparations Ordinance in 2015, and then in 2017, the Department of Justice finding that CPD engaged in a pattern or practice of excessive force, which ultimately led to the 2019 consent decree, which many people will know about. This is to say, this very long history of community folks advocating against and struggling against police brutality and struggles with law enforcement has a very long history that we try to chart throughout the document. Here again is another image displaying some of those, that visualizes some of those disparities in Black incarceration rates in the state of Illinois. Here again, looking at the use of, police use of lethal force between 2014 and 2021, you can see in that pie chart the difference between 61.1% for Black residents and 38.9% for all other groups there. Housing, we discuss, we talk at length about redlining racial covenants, block busting, exclusionary zoning. All of these practices and policies were used to structure and reinforce racial segregation throughout the state. Between 1950 and 1970, 75 to 80% of homes purchased by Black Chicagoans were made through contract sales. And Amber Hendley, who also is here today and who will be talking a little bit about her work, does a really masterful job of talking about this issue in particular, contract sales being a predatory lending model that resulted in loss of wealth and equity for Black residents. Another commentary by Dr. Hunt lets us know that by the mid-20th century, Black residents were being disproportionately funneled into public housing, and that in the 1990s, the federal Hope 6 program led to the demolition of public housing across the state. In Chicago, this showed up as the Plan for Transformation, and despite whatever the hopes for these different programs might have been, what many have found is that it fueled massive displacement for Black residents across the state. So we talk about that. Here, you'll see a chart that just talks about the disparity in poverty rates in different areas in Illinois. And we use this to think about the link between, this is also some of the work that Amber does so well, is to think about the link between housing and home ownership and then poverty and disparities in poverty. Education, another key part of this, we talk about 1825, the free school law is passed. The General Assembly established public education system, but it is explicitly reserved for white citizens, which then means it sets the ground for segregation and under-resourcing that continues to this day. The 1870 Constitution removed the exclusionary language, but still there was, it did not prevent segregation. The 1872 Act Concerning Children is essentially the Illinois version of separate but equal that remained in effect until the 1950s. And today, in almost any indices that you can find, Illinois is either at the top or very near the top of the most segregated public schooling systems in the country. Elizabeth Todd-Breland, who's also with us today, who's really wonderful commentary on education, is critical reading, says that since statehood, the Illinois state legislature has actively facilitated education funding, taxation, and regulatory policies that have increased inequities. And I think that sums up beautifully what we talk about there. The quote here that I want to read is directly from the document because I think it also sums up pretty clearly what we mean when we talk about family. We say the constant threat of displacement, exclusion from adequate wages in schools, and the absence or open hostility of state protections meant that family formation and stability were persistently undermined, not by cultural deficiency, but by structural racism embedded in Illinois' legal, economic, and social systems. So we are really interested here. We're not interested in prescribing or adhering to a particular definition of the family formation. There are many people in this work who actually have, that the nuclear family construct is itself problematic for certain communities, particularly people who are LGBTQI. And so that's not what we're concerned about with. We're concerned about what resources are available to families, however those families are formed. And so Black, from the very beginnings of the state, Black fraternal organizations, women's clubs, churches, and many different kinds of social organizations developed to counter the harmful effects of discrimination that we talk about throughout the report. Examples of this include the created in 1900, the Illinois Federation of Colored Women's Clubs, and then 1913, something I didn't know about before this work, the Alpha Suffrage Club that was founded by Ida B. Wells, which is to say ultimately that Black communities have always done self-help and always done mutual aid. And then I think this is the last one, is health. Institutional segregation, discrimination, and resource disparities affected access to health care as it did every other aspect of Black life. So the Healthy Illinois 2028 is a statewide initiative that was launched by the Illinois Department of Public Health, and one of its 5 priority areas is that it identifies racism as a core determinant of health disparities. So what we talk about in the report is that in Illinois, rates of diabetes, as throughout the country, in Illinois, rates of diabetes, asthma, cancer, hypertension, obesity, high cholesterol, COVID-19 mortality, maternal and infant mortality, drug overdose deaths, and HIV infection are all higher among Black residents. And Black communities, Black people in communities like East St. Louis, Alkel Gardens, and Cahokia Heights are disproportionately exposed to hazardous environmental conditions. And part of my own work that I do around gender violence is to talk about, and in what my submission to the report is to talk about the fact that Black women and girls are also disproportionately the victims of violent crime, including intimate partner violence and homicide, and that in 2023, Black women in Illinois were 9 times more likely than white women to be the victims of homicide and 14 times more likely to die of gun violence. Again, what I would argue is important to think about in terms of reparation. Here again, another chart showing some of those disparities as they show up in the document. Okay, so I'm going to, before I end, this is the moment where I am going to ask people to bear with me to take a point of personal privilege. What I have come away with as the takeaways as the person who has been leading this component of the project for the past 2 years. This is Terrion speaking. I'm not speaking on behalf of ADCRC. I'm speaking on behalf of myself. Though I do think that there are probably people in ADCRC and IRRPP who would agree with me on some of these points. And one is that I really believe what I have learned through this process, I've mentioned this earlier, that Illinois is at the vanguard of the contemporary reparations movement. There is so much organizing work happening here in Chicago, beyond Chicago, the municipal ordinances that have been started here, the work that ADCRC is doing, the work that the state is doing. I think we're really well positioned to do critically important work and to lead the nation in this critically important work. This report is both a necessary precursor, so I mentioned at the outset that there's no recommendations in this report because that is the ongoing work that ADCRC will do. This is the harms report that is the precursor to that. But what I want to say now that my work is done is that I think this still exists as a singular project. I think outlining these harms and having this document be in existence is itself a critically important work, and that I'm grateful that we've been able to do because it documents all in one place histories that have needed to be documented in this way. And I also want to say, as someone who is from Peoria, from the south side of Peoria, I rep zip code 61605, for real, which is, as it turns out, it is one of the most under-resourced communities in the city. It is a place where I grew up going to schools that have all since been changed in one way or another, where I grew up as a little kid being told that our schools were failing, which there's a way in which the thing about failing schools you seem to think must mean that you are failing, or your people are failing, or your community is failing, somebody failing around here, right? And so that I showed up at UIC as an 18-year-old wanting to understand something about myself and wanting to understand something about the community that I came from. A community which I thought very much prepared me to be in the place where I was, even if there were many, many struggles that were there. And I think that what a report like this does for somebody like me, who I hope other young people are coming up who live in communities like these, whether it's the south side of Peoria or the south side of Chicago, or it's Gary, or it's Decatur, or Springfield, or wherever you are, is to understand how you end up there and that it's not because of your failure. Right. Because I think if we're not super careful, we end up in a place where we start to, why does my community look like this? And why do all the other black communities I know of look like this? Because black people won't fill in the blank. That's a lot of what I heard when I was growing up. And I think that what this project does is it helps to give us a context and helps to give us a way of understanding how our communities look, how they look, that do not end with personal failure and pathology, which to me has been critically important in my career as an educator. I also want to say that what I have learned from this work is how critically important grassroots organizing and community activism. None of these projects happen without the work of folks on the ground doing the work, often for years and years and years without people knowing what it is that they're doing. And so keeping the voices of community folks at the center and the organizing that their work that they're doing at the center is critically important. And then finally, reparations are absolutely about looking to the past and understanding how we got here. They're about what's happening in the present. But what I have really taken away from the work that I've been doing is that it also can be future orienting. Two of the quotes that are in the document that have stayed with me are from the illustrious historian Robin Kelley, who in 2002 said, by looking at the reparations campaign in the US as a social movement, we discovered that it was never entirely or even primarily about money. The demand for reparations was about social justice, reconciliation, reconstructing the internal life of Black America, and eliminating institutional racism. And then 20 years later, Olufemi Taiwo says that reparation, like the broader struggle for social justice, is concerned with building the just world to come. Whatever comes next from this process, what is the world that we want for the young people coming behind us? What is the world that we want for ourselves? How can we use the reparations framework to help us think about what justice looks like for all of us in the future, so that we can also think of it as future-oriented. Finally, my acknowledgments, the research team, I just want to make sure to shout out Almethea Franklin, Christopher Powell, and Kamara Heron. These are the folks who did the critically important, yes. The critically important work and responded to my emails. I didn't have to go find anybody at home. I knew where people lived. I could have if I needed to, but it was great. They responded to me, and we were clicking on all cylinders by the end. The IRRPP staff, the editorial and design support team, the consultants and the authors, and the ADCRC research committee, and especially Chair Slaughter. Thank you to all of you for making this possible. That's it. I'm done.
Yep, come on up. Yep, all right. Can we give one more round of applause to Dr. Williamson? Yes, thank you. We have a few questions ready to go for the panel, and then we'll be happy to take any questions that are coming from the folks in the room or the folks on Zoom. The kind of opening question I'm going to give to the whole panel, and we'll ask everybody to respond to, is about the kind of overarching framing that we've offered here. I started today by talking about being proud to be living in the state of Illinois right now, and it's not because we don't have the same history that much all of the United States has in many ways, but because at least in this moment, we are leaning into being honest and transparent about that history and not only documenting it, but try to address it. And so the question for the panel is that when many people imagine the history of Illinois in relation to the country's legacy of Black harm, the image in public discourse that most often comes to surface is that of a free state that opposed slavery and was a beacon of migration for Black families escaping the racism of the South. Part of what this report does is to break apart this myth by documenting the structural harm that Black residents of Illinois have faced since before the state was a state and all the way into the present. And I just want folks to think a little bit about what the importance is of addressing this history, of acknowledging this history in terms of thinking about how to do something about it at a structural and systemic level. Start with Dr. Todd-Breland, thanks.
Thank you so much for that, Amanda. And I just want to thank you all again for putting this together, and a big shout out to Terrion, because she did that. Yeah, I mean, I think the framing, and this is in the report, of Illinois as not a free state is really important. The land that we're on, in addition to being the land of the Council of Three Fires and indigenous folks who have been here for many, many years, continue to be here, that under previous colonial regimes before the United States of America, whether that be the French or British or others, in various parts, the Spanish even a little bit in part of the state, this was a place where enslaved people lived. This was a place where enslaved people moved, and even after, became part of the Northwest Territory and later a state, it was still a place where enslaved people moved. Whether they were coming from other places and moving through the state, or, as was mentioned, there were carve-outs in the Constitution and in the statehood documents for the state of Illinois that allowed for the ongoing nature of slavery in this place. And I also want to extend that, and my colleague who could talk more about labor, but there was a lot of slippage, that there was very little difference between what indenture meant in the state of Illinois and what chattel slavery was during the 19th century here. So I think sometimes while these terms mean something different, there's an example, I believe it's in the report, in the later 19th century of two people being sold on the streets of Illinois, right? Now that was framed as a sale of indenture, but these were black people being sold from one person who was their master via indenture to another person who was their master via indenture. That's enslavement, right? And so I think that framing it in that way is important. The last thing I'll say just briefly is I also want to sort of reframe, and this is in the report as well, mentioned earlier were black laws. Here in the state of Illinois, they were often called black laws. These are black codes. These are laws that formed Jim Crow in the state of Illinois. They remained on the books here through the majority of the 19th century after Illinois became a state, and their reverberations continued beyond that. And so I think when we think about reparations and the way that reparations is often framed as remedy and repair for enslavement, it also has been framed, and is importantly framed, as remedy and repair for Jim Crow, as remedy and repair for ongoing legal and extra-legal forms of control, discrimination, and those things also existed here and continue to have echoes, and in some ways, not just echoes, right? The structures that we continue to endure.
Thank you.
Thank you for that response. Before I get started, I would like to do a few acknowledgments, point of personal privilege. Commissioner Joel Sacknoff, can you please stand, wave? Commissioner Ted Williams, III, can you please stand and wave? Thank you both for coming. Our CMS staff, give us a good wave. And to the authors of the report, we are so eternally grateful for all of your hard work. We're here. We finally did it. It took a little bit to get here, but we're here. Now, to address specifically the question on why this myth has endured, it would require us to think about slavery as an origin point, but is not as a conclusion. Slavery is a comma, and a comma, and a comma, and a comma. And what this report has attempted to do is to draw a through line through all of the many different types of harm experienced by those who were enslaved and the descendants of U.S. chattel slavery in the state of Illinois as a part of a continuous group of harm, not as isolated occurrences that have nothing to do with each other, but as things that reinforced each other, that came from both de jure and de facto, both the things that were legal and on the books and the social attitudes that came from things being legal and on the books. So when we talk about why this myth has endured, it's endured because we still have policies on the books that were created during a time where slavery and owning of my ancestors, and as a proud 11th generation American, I stand here as a descendant of U.S. chattel slavery, 11 generations in, so I wanted to go ahead and say that first, but this matters. And this is part of the reason why this myth has endured. It's the things that are still on the books, but then there are also the attitudes that still exist from individuals who are not educated. So since we're in an institution of higher learning, I have a challenge for you all. I have some homework. Read the report. Bring these conversations to your friends and to your family. And then use those conversations as a way to change the social attitudes as they are today into something that will allow for more equity, equality, and parity in the state of Illinois. Thank you. Yes.
Shall I? Oh, okay. I've taught Illinois history for 6 years at Eastern Illinois University, and one of the most enduring myths is that not only was Illinois as a free state part of this idea that black people would be able to come there and live happily ever after, but also I'm dealing with a second myth too that hasn't really been touched on yet, the myth of Chicago being, actually it was touched on in the slides earlier, the myth of Chicago being a beacon of liberal bastion for black people, which is also an absolute myth, and that myth still stands to this day, and Chicago still remains, if I'm not mistaken, the most segregated city in the country?
Number 3.
Number 3, oh.
Top 5.
Number 3, okay, we're still in the top 5, that's great. But my point, and when I deal with my students at Danville Correctional Institution, they marvel at the idea that in 1966, as the slide showed earlier, that Martin Luther King came here and said that this was the worst type of demonstration of white angst that he had ever seen. And I think Dr. Williamson had mentioned earlier about, Dr. King had been throughout the South and battling all kinds of battles in the South. And once he comes to Chicago, he says, oh my God, I've never seen anything like this. Andrew Jackson. I forgot his name.
Young.
Andrew Young, thank you. Andrew Young said the same thing. But my point, I guess, in perspective here, is that this myth persists in large part, I think, because of the ignorance we have of places like Chicago, places of Illinois in particular. If we look at the southern portion of Illinois, for example, there's an idea that Chicago is this place where black people can go and prosper and do all kinds of great things. But yeah, as we've discovered, that this is not true. And yeah, I love the fact that this report tackles that, and each of our panelists have touched on this as well too.
And comma.
And comma.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So everything that everyone said, just adding on, I think that the focus on the entry point, this alleged free state, is why the myth persists, and not paying attention to the actual conditions that existed before black folk came here, and then what was the reality for black folk when we got here. Like in housing, we were relegated to a black belt, denied mortgages, and then sold predatory land sale contracts, and then things that came after that. In housing, in education, if your housing is segregated, so are your schools. Overcrowding, under-resourced, intentional mismanagement is easy to happen and does happen. In health, not having access to health care or relegated to substandard health care, or not having investments in the systems that you created for your own well-being and your health. We have justice, right? So black neighborhood is always, we talked about the hate crimes and the white terror campaigns. That's all throughout the report. The surveillance, the over-surveillance, the over-policing, that started from, everything that I'm saying is from beginning to end when black folk first came here. So the over-policing, that leans more towards, it's not about protection, but control for this group of people. Then we have in the economy, black workers are funneled into or confined to lower paying jobs. Wealth is extracted through mechanisms like predatory land sale contracts and other things, union issues. And that is not what people are thinking about. They're just saying there was a free entry. It was not a site of freedom. The conditions were always different. The conditions were always about segregating and extracting and harm was continuous. This was not a free state. There was no free state in the United States, whether slavery was legal or not. There was no free state for Black folk. That's just not the reality. I think it's also able to persist because a lot of these things are positioned as being race neutral. And they happen across sectors and not just in place. You can account for them in place, but again, they happened across education, justice, economic access or development. And it was also in policy. So it's easy to also act like the myth is true and it's about what people are doing wrong because it's embedded in the policies.
I mean, Amber said something that was really interesting. How many of you are familiar with the Black codes? So for the Black folks in the room, how many people can gather without being imprisoned? Less than 2. Less than 2. How many Black individuals can gather in groups without being imprisoned? So all y'all going to the Gallatin County salt mines. To be able to even enter into the state of Illinois, a $1,000 bond had to be put up, and you only could be able to stay within the state for between 7 and 10 days without forfeiting that bond. Who had $1,000 in that time to come into that state? Exactly. So these are the real and tangible ways that that level of over-surveillance is not only pervasive then, but also influences how policy is formed now.
It's interesting, too. Just to piggyback off of that as well, too, if we're exploring this myth, obviously we have the great emancipator, and I put that in quotations, as president from 61 to 60, starting in 1860. But the myth that Abraham Lincoln was this great emancipator who, I mean, as great of a president as he actually was, we still have to grapple with the idea that the Black law stayed on the books after his assassination. Yep. So he had an opportunity to eliminate that, or at least to push for the elimination of the Black laws while he was alive, but he did not do that. In fact, we also know, again, if we're exploring myths as well, we know that Abraham Lincoln was a major proponent of shipping Black people out of the country as a colonizer or the colonial movement. So we know that, again, we're still exploring these myths as well, too. So there's a lot of things going on in Illinois that we continuously need to explore.
I'd like to put a question to both Elizabeth Todd-Breland and Dr. Ward, which is about resistance. So the report documents in immense amounts of detail the history and legacy of racial harm against Black Illinoisans, but it also documents at every historical juncture the history of active resistance against that harm and Black community organizing as a response. And I'd love for you to reflect a little bit about that. Yeah.
Well, maybe I'll just give some sort of context. So my piece was on education, and I want to say something just to put in context why I think it's actually particularly important for us to frame education as somewhere where remedy and redress, where the place that we should be directing that is at the state level. So in the United States, the federal government, there actually is not anything in our United States Constitution that specifically says that public education must be provided for all people. That lives at the state level. And so often we think of public education as something that's very local, and it is. But the reason that it's local is because the state delegates that authority to the local level. So ultimately, it is in fact the state of Illinois, that is responsible fiscally and in oversight and in all types of different ways for what actually happens at the local level, because it is that power that they have, that the state has, that is then delegated to the local level. So to that end, in the state of Illinois, there was not the provision of public education at a state level for Black children until the 1870s. Prior to that, as early as 1825, there was public education that was required for white children. Black parents had to pay into a tax called the school tax, yet that money was not guaranteed to ever make it to their children. And so to your point about resistance, there's lots of ways that showed up even during that period. There were parents in Alton, Illinois, and other places that sued over the fact that they were paying these taxes for schools that their children were not allowed to, public schools, that their children were not allowed to attend. Now, before even taking a legal route, local communities of Black residents were building up their own educational institutions. Church groups, local parents were getting together and creating educational opportunities for Black children when the state abdicated that responsibility. But these parents got together and they sued the state government and said, we are paying these taxes and our children can't go there. And the remedy that ultimately was put in place was that, okay, well, you can get a refund. You can get a refund. The refund was not enough to build up a school system, right? So you see then the way that these inequities get baked in even when an alleged remedy is put in place. They would rather refund the money than allow or require Black children to be able to go to school in schools that had white children in them potentially. Finally, when in the 1870s, it was required that public education be extended to Black children, there were communities that created, as we know, separate and underfunded schools for Black children. There were places like Edwardsville, Illinois, where they said, well, we're not going to build a new high school. So instead, we'll just send kids to East St. Louis, where we heard there's a Black high school, or to the state of Missouri, where there are some high schools that exist, rather than create this now mandated. So the levels, I want to talk about resistance in two ways. Resistance by Black communities, but massive resistance by white Illinoisans, that's right, Illinoisans, to actually the implementation of remedies to racial discrimination and oppression. And so you see families in Cairo saying that, no, we are going to fight for a high-quality high school for Black children in this community. You see in places like Chicago, where there was some bucking of the trend to some degree in saying, well, we will, in 1850, they said in Chicago, we will let Black children go to school. And while there were not that many Black children here, they could go to school with white kids. But when the Great Migration hit, and now there's a whole lot of Black children here, now you need to go to separate and unequal schools. And we see the masses of parents and students and community organizations who come together to fight back against that forcefully, not even primarily with the goal of ultimately or always having integration as a solution, but in fact, many of these early struggles by Black parents in the early 20th century were for equal funding. That, okay, well, it's not, the biggest issue to us is not that our children go to school without white children, it's that look at the different conditions in our school, look at the different resources in our school. And so coming together to fight back against those things forcefully, and on and on. So I'll stop talking about that for now.
Yeah.
Oh, that was good. That was good stuff. That's good stuff. There's a long thread of activism amongst Black Illinoisans that go back to the 1840s. And one of my students brilliantly asked, well, Professor Ward, why did it only start in the 1840s? Like, well, it actually didn't, but in terms of activism and Black leadership, that's when you start to see, specifically about 1847, this Black activism come to the core, this resistance to, say, the Black laws and other discriminations that were affiliated with the Black laws. But you take the 1847 Illinois Constitution that attempts to strengthen the Black laws. And then this is when you see someone like John Jones, famous activist, Black Taylor, by the way, from Chicago, where he actually writes a letter to the Western Citizen, an abolitionist paper, and in my opinion, that really kind of jumpstarts the activism that we get to know amongst Black Illinoisans by 1847 in that protest. And other forms of protest come from Black leadership, come from that moment when you start to see the Black conventions, famously starting by the 1829 back east, but Illinois begins to have their own Black conventions by 1856 in Alton, Illinois, to start it off. But again, that continuous thread of activism amongst the Black leaders also filters down to the Black working class too, especially when you start to look at what Black workers began to do with the labor activism by, I'd say, about the 1870s. And so, yeah, you start to see this long thread of activism amongst black people, black leaders in Illinois. Famously, I mean, for example, one of my favorite examples takes place in the 1870s when black workers began to, let's say, they go against the grain by beginning to start affiliating with the Knights of Labor. And one of the things I fight, again, we're still talking about myths, I guess. One of the myths that I fight against consistently is the idea that black people in general, black Americans in general, were not union people or they were anti-labor. And nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, I mean, if anything, they became anti-labor, and I put that in quotations, I hope everybody can see that. They become anti-labor as white workers and white leaders began to push them out of better paying jobs and also union membership as well too. And so the idea that these black workers fought vehemently, and I like the term we used earlier, yeah, they were at the vanguard of that union movement by the 1870s, and that lasts up until the turn of the century. Again, by that time, you start to see them being pushed out, forced out of these, not only union jobs, but also higher paying jobs as well too. So yeah, that activism was very strong too. I'll stop talking.
And since you brought up the point on kind of black labor and white labor, I think the idea that there's a differentiation in any space comes from the fact that there was exclusion in that space, including the black church.
Good point.
And the white church. There's no need for a black church if we had a white church that actually followed the doctrine of the Bible that they profess, including where two or more gather, there I am in the midst. Here we go again with the black codes. You see how this all ties together? You see how we can literally tie a thread through so many different issues? And how it is actually kind of remarkable how brilliant white individuals who were dedicated to subjugating and extracting from black Americans, how brilliant they actually were. Because these systems keep kind of self-perpetuating in weird and interesting ways. The more we try to break them apart, the more they reinforce themselves. But I think that the activism component also, the more they try to break that apart, the more it evolves and reinforces itself. And we see that in movements like after the killing of George Floyd. And the type of activism and energy that came out of that movement was important, and it was actually vital to getting this piece of legislation that established this commission passed. But when we look around, do we see that same coalition today to be able to get the recommendations of this commission passed? And this is where we must turn to each and every single one of our neighbors and say, if you were convicted at that time about the killing of a black man, yet the killings have not stopped, maybe the media attention to them isn't as prominent, are we still dedicated to the idea of justice or equity or equality or parity? Or were those just things that we talked about? And before I yield the mic, I do want to acknowledge our Chicago Reparations Task Force.
Yeah.
Task Force member Slade, you want to wave? All right.
Now I'm going to pose a question that's both for Amber and Terrion. And it has to do with, we've been talking about a history of black harm, and there are lots of ways that both of the work you're doing talks about that history being up until, yesterday and today, and the kind of ways it continues into the present. Amber, I'd love for you to talk a little bit about the ways in which the profit motives drove not just, right, so it's not just about discrimination, but about extraction and about how that extraction continues and the work that you're doing today to try to address some of that. And then Terrion, I was hoping you might speak a little bit to the ongoingness of harm, particularly in the devaluing of black life and black women's lives in particular, in the work that you're doing now. So we'll go to Amber and then to Terrion.
Okay, so I think what you're referencing is my work on the plunder of black wealth,
Yeah.
which is about housing exploitation in Chicago. And it's not this singular event. I'll talk about contract selling, but I'll talk about how it was built up to. It is a system that evolved to maintain something specific, which was this system of confinement I've been saying, or segregation, which my favorite, Maria's not here, but segregation is a major important conversation between Tonika Johnson, one of my collaborators, and one of the professors that was just here, Maria Creason. So that confinement, then that exclusion, active exclusion, and then the extraction. And so we can start the Great Migration, the first Great Migration up here. By 1930, 93% of Black folk were in a handful of communities. They were already spatially segregated. When we're talking about my particular research around contract selling, again, that exclusion or that confinement is there. Then we have that active exclusion with redlining and FHA policy, actively denying Black folk whether they are qualified or not to access to traditional mortgages. As a result, that wealth or that potential, that capital is actively extracted or is funneled outside of these Black neighborhoods or communities. Then we have that active extraction, that active exclusion, right? So now this market creates this prime condition in a capitalistic society for exploitation, which happens when white speculators come in using a mechanism we know as blockbusting to get white folk to say, these FHA mortgages are now accessible to you, and Black people are coming in. You already see your neighborhood is majority Black, and they're coming, they're continuing to come. So you might as well sell to me low before your property values plummet anyway. So these white speculators get these homes at a great deal themselves, and then sell to Black homeowners, well, aspiring Black homeowners on a predatory land sale contracts. I always want to note that a land sale contract in and of itself is not a bad thing. Sometimes that is the best way for you to have a deed transferred to you in a way that you win, because interest rates are, and credit scores link also to race, and doing that in the traditional way could be more attractive to you. So I'm just putting that out there. They're not all terrible, but these were predatory land sale contracts because the language that we identified that was consistent across them is that they were highly inflated mortgage payments. Like I said, 84% was the average that we saw above what the white speculator paid for this particular home. The condition said that if you missed one payment, you forfeited everything. We also found, I'm not sure if we put this in the report, but we also found larger down payment requirements for Black homebuyers than we saw that was traditionally required for FHA, for traditional FHA financing, whatever that down payment was. We saw that Black folk were paying more, not just the amount, like percentage, right? They were already paying more, but then that percentage was even higher. So that's a double exploitation. So again, you forfeit everything. You've paid this higher down payment. You've paid this high monthly payment. The language would say, again, you miss one payment, you forfeit everything. Or the two common things that we saw, the deed would be transferred if this homeowner, I'm using air quotes too if you can't see me, if you paid half of your principal, right? Or you had to wait until the end. So some things that we didn't talk about in the report is the burden of that as well, because we have always made less. Today we make less. We're making less, we're paying more. I always like to note that anybody who did pay off that contract was a resilient, amazing Black person who also lost a lot of money and wealth because they paid too much for it, and they had to forfeit a lot of other opportunities that they were due and worthy of. So there was no equity accumulation. A traditional mortgage, you would get that. There was none of that. If you lost your home, you lost everything. No ownership until final payment was a common thing. Immediate eviction upon missed payments. Full responsibilities. So this is something else. You were responsible for any violations. So say you did pay that violation from the city. You did fix up that leak in the roof, and then you missed your payment. You also then forfeit all of that. You were also responsible for paying the taxes on that home. That's what the language said. And it didn't explain, it just said P&I was one lump sum. It didn't explain what you were paying towards anything. So nothing was clear as to what it was that high payment was actually contributing to. And so it's just reinforcing this was a system. Segregation created the market, policy restrained things, and then the market just monetized. And that's just kind of what happens.
Yeah, thank you. Terrion.
So between 2003 and 2004, 9 Black women were killed in my hometown of Peoria, Illinois. Why I be talking so much about Peoria? Because I think that's really important.
Right.
That is the work that brought me back to attending to my hometown, a place that years before I was like, get me up out of here as fast as possible, no looking back. And it turned out that this started to happen in my community to people, one of whom I had known personally, had gone to church with. And that was the work. And I had never heard of anything like this happening in a community such as mine. And so the project that I've been working on for years now that has developed out of that is trying to understand something about what happened there. Not who did it, I know who did it. And if you want to know who did it, you can look it up, I'm not going to tell you. That's not what I was interested in. What I have been deeply interested in understanding is what are the conditions of possibility for 9 Black women to be killed, one after another, after another, after another, in a city with fewer than 120,000 people. And it's not like headline news everywhere, right? And so I have been for years trying to understand and grapple with what has happened in my community, and understanding that not as a function of any failure on the part of my community, but as a function of all of the things that we're talking about in this report, the ground upon which we walk, the resource disparities that have happened in my community, that all of that becomes the ground from which those women are killed. And it turns out what I have learned through the work that I've been doing is Peoria is not the anomaly that I once thought it was, but that in East St. Louis and multiple times in Chicago, Decatur, other places throughout the state, and certainly other places throughout the country, Black women have been killed over and over and over and over and over and over again. And so part of why I am invested in this project and what it stands and what it means to think about it is because just as we talk about, I think there's much more fluidity now with talking about like mass incarceration as a function of many of the things that we're talking about here. But there's a lot less language around gender violence when we talk about these things. And so I'm really critically interested in thinking about how we attend to that and how we think about all these 9 categories of harm that we talk about all feed into the disparate levels of violence that Black women and girls and Black LGBTQ people experience in our communities.
I'm going to combine a couple of questions we got from the audience. Before Lisa Lee walks out of the room, I wanted to acknowledge some of our key partners who are doing this work. Lisa Lee of the National Public Housing Museum. We have folks from the Chicago Freedom School right here, yes. Are from Artworks, people doing important work in the art world. We have folks from the Village Leadership Academy, and It Takes a Village family of schools. Part of the reason I'm pointing these folks out is because one of the questions we got is, and I'm going to combine these, what would you recommend K-12 educators, cultural workers, and artists do to engage with this research report and write more and invite more people to engage, organize, and work towards solutions? So that's one. And sort of related to this is this question of both, we're trying to do this work to change institutions, but there's also a challenge about how do we sustain, build, endow Black-led independent institutions as part of this work if we're serious about, building systems that Black folks can control, et cetera. So I'm going to let anybody who wants to tackle one of those.
I think it's important to note that the harm was about extraction. Extraction of wealth, extraction of opportunity. So if you're going to repair that harm, would mean that you would have to do what? Invest. If the harm was relegated in economic terms as the siphoning of wealth, of economic activity, of consumer surplus, government surplus, then that means that there has to be a level of repair of that economic extraction. So when we talk about how do we help Black organizations and Black institutions, I'm not sure many people understand the fiscal state of most Black institutions, but it ain't good. And part of the reason is why we outlined in this report, because of the wealth that has been siphoned from our community. We are a very resilient people. And the way that our organizations have gotten to where they are today is through the human capital, the social capital that we've learned to leverage. But, you know, we can only go so far with human and social capital when you don't have no actual capital. Green spins. So how do we repair some of that harm? We have to have an influx of capital into these systems to be able to help them to be self-sustaining so that they don't have to depend on the generosity of benevolent white folks. So I'll stop there.
Thanks. I also want to give a shout out to Eugene Robinson, who is here from Chicago Public Schools, who runs their Black Student Success work, and I appreciate that work and intentionality behind it. I guess, I want to be clear, I am speaking as Elizabeth Todd-Breland, not for the, nothing else.
Okay.
But I'll say this, so one of the things, it's been invoked a few times today, so I want to say something about this briefly, the reparations for survivors of Burge here in Chicago. And I think that has been a landmark piece of reparations legislation, watching pieces of it roll out over time, understanding that it came from a legacy of many, many, many years of struggle to get the government to do this. This was not a benevolent thing that happened. But also, and again, this is very much I here, because we are continue to be grateful for the largesse of the city of Chicago, and we're gonna get this memorial to happen. But it's been striking to me in the last 10, now almost 11 years since this piece of legislation went into effect, how much money the folks trying to organize to make these things happen have continued to have to raise. Why are we going to Mellon asking for money if this is reparations? Why is there constant, fundraising that has to happen? Why is it the responsibility of community-based organizations and folks that led these fights for justice to now try and figure out how to get the land, transfer the land over, steward the land, pay for it indefinitely? Is that reparations, ? And so I guess to bring that to our conversation today, I want to say something about this point about extraction and exploitation that's come up. There's a colleague of mine in Black Studies, Noliwe Rooks, who has this term called segronomics. And I love it because it's so on point. It's this idea that segregation is very profitable, has been, continues to be, because of the things that my colleagues here have talked about, creating a closed market, speculating, extraction, exploitation. It's profitable. And so when we think about where we're going to go to ask for and demand both the benefits and who is responsible for giving those benefits, we should be capacious in our understanding of who that is. Yes, it's the state and should be, government broadly, right? And should be the state, but also the many other entities that have profited off of both the system of enslavement, ongoing Jim Crow, and exploitation of a closed market vis-a-vis segregation. That includes life insurance companies, real estate organization, the banks in this country that were propped up and started, in fact, by speculating on slave markets and Black bodies, right? And so I think as we're thinking about then where to try to connect to this idea of investment, I think you've hit it, right? That there are many different places. I do think there's both the question in terms of independent Black institutions and maybe this question of reparations more generally. People don't like to give, return, I don't know what to say, reckon with your dollars and not have some say over where that money goes and what happens to it, but that's actually required by reparations. That's not optional. You can't say, here's the money, and then here's specifically how you have to use it, Black institution that has been standing up on, threads for years in that. And so I guess I would just, as we move forward, to think about the space between our words and our deeds relative to reparations and what that can mean. I appreciate the ways that Illinois has been stood up today as a vanguard of this because of the work that the people on the ground have done, as well as the actions and direction of the state. But those deeds are important, right? And I think we see that even in places like the state of Illinois, that now, in the same way we talk about a free state in the past, we're framed as the resistance, right? We're slowly rolling back DEI at the University of Illinois. We're slowly rolling back DEI all across state government. you have to be about it. You can't just say what you're going to do in these spaces. And so I think it's also on all of us to demand that that happens.
Unfortunately, we're about to run out of time, but I want to give the last minute to Chair Slaughter to maybe talk about what's next for the ADCRC so we can all participate.
So I want each of you to grab one of these public hearing flyers. You can grab them from Program Manager Mikasa Johnson. She's passing out the public hearing flyers. It's going to be at the DuSable Museum on this Saturday, the 25th, from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. We have an excellent lineup of speakers that include Dr. William Darity, Reverend Dr. Jonathan Brooks, Cleola Brown, and more. So come out. We're going to be talking a bit about the report, but also where we go from here. And be on the lookout. Go to our website at adcrc.illinois.gov. We will be launching our survey where we will allow the public to rank, in rank order, the recommendations that we have for each of our 9, technically 11, areas of harm, right? So we have policies that we have developed. We have compiled these policies. We've put them into a survey. We're going to allow the community to rank these policies so then we can take this to the legislature and to our governor and say, hey, we got 150,000. There we go. We got 150,000 people who want this. Mm-hmm. These are the things that we should prioritize. So I encourage you all to participate in that way. We have open meetings every month. We encourage you to participate. If you have ideas for repair, any additional recommendations, please feel free to submit them on our website. Otherwise, just be engaged. Be on the lookout. Talk to your friends. Talk to your family. This is going to require a little bit of a lift from the community, individuals who are descendants, and allies to be able to get this across the finish line. So I encourage everybody to remain abreast of all the things that are going on with the commission. Thank you.
All right, join me in thanking the panelists here today. Dr. Williamson and the amazing research team, all of the folks at CMS who helped make all this possible. 2 other quick announcements. One is please take 2 or 3 extra copies of the report that are out there and give them to people that you think need to be reading them. We have some additional work that we've been doing with the state of Illinois. We have an event coming up releasing a new report on Latinx homelessness in Illinois, structural drivers of inequality. That's going to be on May 18th. There's a flyer outside. Please join us for that, for thinking about that. And I am learning to always say, if you'd like to support future programs and the work of the Institute, we have a donation table set up outside. So please sign up to participate with us in whatever way you're able to. Thank you, everybody, for coming out today for this important work. Thanks.